We'll see what happens when you forget. The myth goes out the window.
But you layer onto it. This is a much more productive place than we are going than I was planning on. So I'm happy about this. I just don't have the pictures for it.
Okay.
And I'm too visual. So the point of these memory palaces, which I thought we were going to be talking about, which is fine, is that they give you.
Mine's clearly broken.
That's
down.
fine. I'm showing Camillus's now. They give you a structure to put things in, and I realize this is the way I study history. I have to have a picture, but insofar as I am anchoring the arguments that I'm making to a design, to a diagram, I'm very medieval in my memory practice, right? Or maybe Dante, right? We can talk about Dante, put him in the universe, right? That you know things because you've ordered them in this diagrammatic structure. And that diagram, I mean, in a practical sense, keeps you from going nuts because there's a place for everything. But it's sort of a spatial representation of something that can work both temporally and spatially, so linearly and geometrically.
Okay.
And that is the sort of mystical woo-woo stuff that I think your book has been pointing to. He's saying the Romans used this kind of structuring of knowledge to give themselves an identity, and we see it played out in the landscape and in the architecture, and that's the way they define themselves as a people. That is true. Whether he's accurate in his representation of the ancient Roman understanding of it's very interesting because the Renaissance and modernity has used that in ways that we've built out our cities, we've designed whole sort of urban plans of architecture. What's fascinating is that right now in the present, people don't tend to know that stuff. And it's
well, they've forgotten.
It's relatively new. I mean, it's within, it was blown up and lost after 1945 for the most part.
Okay. So we've got the what you described just then about how to order memory sounded a lot like a cross. Having the temporal and then the vertical. The writer mentions that in this book as a part of the practice. They were working on 2 levels of memory formation, but that sounds a lot like the cross. It also sounds a lot like what the church has done.
Yes.
throughout the millennia of its existence. So can you explain that a little better? Because you've sort of, we've got the pantheon as a church, and now what you've just described sounds to me a lot like what the church has been doing.
Aha. Right. And then you end up with, so modernity's great amnesia about Christianity, which is certainly a place I'm happy to go for. That it tells itself stories about, I mean, the Renaissance did this, right? The Renaissance neo-pagans, I think, like Giordano Bruno. I mean, he does this sort of fancy, I'll put his eye back up, sort of mystical, philosophical design structure. He got burned as a heretic. So yay, Bruno. That in the 15th and 16th centuries, the scholars, the intellectuals, are very excited by the pagan literature that they're reading. Now, they create a story that, throughout the Middle Ages, nobody was reading this stuff. That's somewhat true, but not entirely, because there are texts that they're studying that had not been studied in that way in the Middle Ages. Some of the texts they're discovering, they are finding in 9th and 10th century copies, and then they say, these are the ancient manuscripts. Like, no, they're actually Carolingian, so they're technically medieval. Even as they're trying to make these great memory palaces and this story of antiquity and the Renaissance, they're inventing another one. That's always the first layer that you have to get through to get to the point where you understand how much we've lost in modernity. That the modernity itself, the Renaissance, invents it's how many layers of invention have we gone here, right? We've got the, let's say, the Greeks inventing themselves through their Homeric epics, which is one layer, because those epics were, you know, of a past that's older than the time when we think they were written down. The Romans coming along some hundreds of years later, like 1,000, you know, when is Homer supposed to be written? Rome's not founded till 753. Well, that's a long time, right? They look back on the Greek stories and say, we want that, so they write their own, but those are completely invented and made up. I mean, we'll talk about what Christianity does, which is a little different. Then in the Renaissance, the Italians come along and say, oh, well, we like these ancient lineages of story that we used to think we had, so they're going to invent that. A few hundred years later, after that, the fascists come along and say, well, Rome, Italy hadn't existed throughout until the 19th century. Italy as a country, as a nation, is invented in the 19th century, and then the fascists have to come along and give them a whole new version of this myth. And they make a lot of architecture in the 20th century to shore up that mythology. So it's this storytelling and this architecture over and over and over again. And you can get very weary of saying, well, when is the history actually real? Yeah.
Well, how do you know then?
Oh, man, you think I sound nuts enough now? Okay, so there's two ways that this works, and now I'm showing the library. Okay. One, you have buildings, and you know, because, well, I spoke last week at an architecture conference, so I'm thinking it's like architecture is very interesting because it's very purposefully done always. I mean, you can do it for ceremony, you can do it for acoustics, you can do it for symbolism. In McLuhan terms, it's always, you know, our architecture is the obviously the most monumental extension that we have of our bodies, because it's somehow like a skeleton to keep you safe when you're inside it. And then you extend architecture out into a whole city, and right, you have this built environment, and it is obviously far more durable than the people who build it. Some of it is, anyway. It's stone, right? So it continues to exist, but it's still an extension of our imagination and ourselves. So it's you have that one layer of architecture, and then since I'm showing the library. And then there's the stories that we tell about it, right? So there's the script, the written stuff, the spoken things, the language part, and the building part. And both of these together can create incredibly strong illusions, which is the mystical part. My historian sense is colliding with my McLuhan sense, and I'm trying to figure out which one wins. Because McLuhan actually understood the way in which the media are creating story, you know, sort of grounding it. So I was talking about that there's these memory palaces of imagination that Bruno and the Renaissance adepts were creating, but a building itself carries memory because of the time span that it exists through, and I mean the way people have interacted with it, but also it's like a tree in terms of its outliving human lifespans. So things happen in it, and it carries that story, which is different now, which is also in my thought. It's different from the design that you give to the building itself.
So it brings me back again to what is the church doing differently to maintain its story amongst all of this? Are we just imagining our own myth amongst a bunch of other imagined myths?
That's one option.
Or are we remembering something that other people forget?
That's another option.
Okay.
Well, okay, so what's interesting, I mean, for Christianity, and I think we have gotten to this, that we are wrestling with what the question that Augustine posed about the different cities, right? The city of the world and the city of God. And
Yes.
what Augustine understood was the city of God was not identical with any one political entity or even secular world community, because he's writing after the sack of Rome in 410 by Alaric Visigoth, who Vox has talked a lot about, like why the Visigoths were even in the empire in the first place. Misplaced compassion, or bargains that the emperor shouldn't have made. That's where Vox gets his sink the ships thing, for those who are listening on unauthorized. So Alaric sacks Rome because he hasn't been paid. And then the Romans have to look at themselves and say, wait a minute, we were the eternal city. We've just been looted. And Augustine, not in Rome, he's in Hippo near Carthage at the time, ironically, has to come up with a reasoning for why Christianity hasn't betrayed the empire. So why is it to say that the Christians aren't responsible for the sack of the city because the gods have been abandoned? The old gods of the city have been abandoned because there's all these, the Christians, they've abandoned the actual traditions and mythology and sacrifices and genius of the ancient empire, and that's what the Christian argument becomes, at least in the West, is there's a difference between that worldly entity of the city and the true city to which we belong as Christians.
So Augustine talks about city of man versus city of God.
City of the world. So city of the world. It's all human.
City of the world.
City of the world, yeah. So technically secular, right? The secular versus the heavenly, the city of God. The Cyculum, the age, the city of the world.
In that sense, then, what is the architecture of the city of God? Because if it's described as a city, there has to be an architecture. There is an architectural component to a city. It's got to be different. Different
from... Well, okay, so this is interesting.
This is secular.
This is interesting because here McLuhan actually helps, because you say architecture is an expression of our humanity. And that's why you say modern architecture is so horrible, because it's been disrupted. It no longer belongs to our human experience. I mean, E. Michael Jones has talked about this a lot, that modern architecture is, I mean, you say the fascist brutalist, I mean, it gets even worse, right? That you end up with architecture that has no relationship to bodies. I guess it's built by machines, so why would it? And it's more inhabited by machines than it is by our physical selves. And a church should be, in fact, a representation of the soul. It should be built so that it is, in fact, a human reality.
What would a good example of this be?
Oh, well, a Gothic church, certainly. But the thing is, I think churches built by human labor. If you think about pre-modern churches built by human labor, I'm liking this answer in my head, and in my heart, are going to be more directly an expression of our physical and spiritual reality than buildings built by machines. We've abstracted too far through the machines to architecture that no longer expresses that. I mean, so this conference I was at last week, it's a architecture school at Judson University, which is an evangelical school up in the north of the city in Chicago. It's outside of Chicago. It's actually north of here, and church architecture is a very controversial subject always, because it is trying to express both a use and a spiritual experience that people get quite passionate about. I mean, the modern churches that evangelicals will build tend to be assembly churches, so you're worried about the pulpit and the place, watching the preaching, and about creating a sense of gathering, right? So they look like auditoria.
Well, can you trust your memory? This is kind of why I wanted to have the discussion on memory as well, because according to this writer, a part of what the fascists wizards I call them wizards because they're wizards. It's just, it's wizardry, like Owen always says, but it's correct in this sense because they really were wizards. So we've got this attempt at creating a kind of aristocracy out of the development of elite intellectual and spiritual powers. Included in that is the mnemonic development. So who is going to be able to remember and who is going to be able to forget? And I've talked about this somewhat regarding the COVID situation in Australia, because once again we seem to have slipped back completely into public amnesia. Something that didn't happen that long ago, which for everyone in the rest of the world, I'm sure you would have looked on from the outside and seen that things got a little spicy down here. I find it really interesting that we were almost in at the stage of declaring concentration camps to be an acceptable solution. That is discussing it.
Really?
No one's talking
it's
about it.
It's just gone.
Yes.
Okay, so we have, camps and building and the architecture and the memory. It's very interesting. And you can have the buildings there and people not even believe what they were for. I think is interesting too. Yeah. Well,
what I suppose this is where I'm sort of thinking on. Okay, we've got this amnesia here that has occurred that doesn't seem to be as strong in other parts of the world, and then what we're actually doing as Christians in our church is developing our memory, but in a different way. Because instead of trying to construct a fascist system, because we're not trying to construct a fascist system, but we are trying to remember. We are trying to develop our memory, our collective memory as Christians within the church. What we're actually doing, it's not that different to creating monuments. We're just but it's not just building the church building itself, because we have to remember church history ourselves, in that by definition we're not secular. We're not in the world.
Right.
We're responsible for the archiving and for the memorialization of the church's story and the church's mythology. It's completely on us to do that. Otherwise, if we were relying on the secular, there wouldn't be the distinction between the secular and the church. It would be other people tell us what our history is.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yes. Well, what as you're speaking, I was like, okay, this is my remit as a historian. The only true history is Christian. And so as you're talking, I was saying that so here my manifesto, Christ anchors time.
Quick. And then that's a sort of defiance of all ritual that isn't the worship of the Lord, ultimately.
Yeah, it gets very simple if we get to this point, right? It's like either you worship God or you don't.
Yep. Yep.
And so that the powers and realities are all actually of the same order. It's the singular difference is directed towards truth or not. And I mean, that's I say, if you're not directed toward truth, you can't tell a coherent story. One, I mean, and in this sense, for Christian history, and this, I was thinking about this with respect to the Christian monarch, right? Christian monarchs, it's in the 17th or in the 17th century when monarchs are actually claiming more than they maybe should in authority, that you develop political theories of divine right. Well, I think I understand that. What I don't know, and this is the sort of the invention of history, the invention of community, the invention of, I mean, we're trying to find out is, where does faith come from? Where do you suddenly, and what I was going to say back when I first invoked Augustine is, what Augustine understood as conversion was the recognition of yourself in that story, the recognition of yourself in the story of the church. And we are trying to understand how we bring people to that, I would say.